Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. Coming up, how the US presidential election has been blighted by a campaign of disinformation, including misogynist and racist content. I'll be talking shortly to American disinformation expert Nina Jankowicz. Also, a group of indigenous women from Greenland are seeking compensation from the Danish Government over a campaign of involuntary birth control during the 1960s and 70s. But first, and with just weeks to go to the US presidential election, the war of disinformation is reaching new heights. The Democrats' nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris, is no stranger to racist and misogynist attacks online, both as a woman in politics and also as a woman of colour. This is online moderation by tech companies has significantly diminished since the 2020 presidential election. Nina Jankowicz is a specialist in disinformation and democratisation. In 2024, she co-founded the American Sunlight Project, a non-profit focused on countering disinformation. And she joins me today from Arlington in Virginia. Nina, thank you very much for your time. If we're going to use a weather warning system as an analogy of the situation regarding online disinformation and violence, where are we at? Is it flashing amber or red?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think definitely stormy skies ahead for the foreseeable future. And I would say we're in the orange zone. Things aren't quite as bad, perhaps, as they were during the COVID-19 pandemic. But, we're about to head into a consequential presidential election. And there's still a significant amount of the population and one of the party's nominees who doesn't recognize the results of the last election. So I'm strapping in for a wild couple of months here in Washington.
Indeed. And in regards to that presidential campaign, Kamala Harris has been extremely strategic and not playing the race or gender card. Yet the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, can't help himself in making demeaning racist and misogynist remarks. How is this playing out with the American electorate?
Well, I think it's really interesting to note that at Trump rallies, there are independent vendors outside of the venues that sell shirts and other merchandise that have racist and misogynist slogans on them. Things like Joe sucks, Kamala swallows, and other things that I can't say on air, but that are equally, if not more, offensive. And this has become a feature, not an aberration, in this Republican Party. So to me, it's no surprise to see former President Trump repeating these things on his social media platforms, making allusions to them, and sometimes even more overt references to them on the campaign trail. In 2020, I did a piece of research for the Wilson Center that looked at how 13 women in political life were abused and subject to disinformation across 6 social media platforms over 2 months. And when we found 336,000 pieces of online abuse or disinformation, 78% of that was targeted toward then Senator and Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris. And that has only increased since then.
What does this all mean for women's political participation, given this high level of online abuse?
Well, I think there is a misconception that the online and offline worlds are different things. And we know from having lived through the COVID-19 pandemic that the internet is now a crucial part of how everyone lives their lives, from, using your iPhone as a form of payment to connecting with loved ones and friends around the world. And for people to say that when women are experiencing massive amounts of abuse online, that is just mean words, it's an impediment to living your life, to enjoying your life, to doing work, to expressing yourself online. And we've seen many prominent women talk about the fact that the abuse that they receive when running for office, when expressing themselves, when simply, participating in their political process and enjoying their rights to free expression, they are hit with these sorts of misogynist and racist attacks that men simply aren't subject to. And it makes women think twice about getting involved. I myself have interviewed and done focus groups, in particular with younger women who say, I'm not going to have public profiles online because I've seen what's happened to some of my friends. I've seen what's happened to women like Kamala Harris. And frankly, women in the Republican Party as well are not immune from receiving this sort of abuse. And they just don't want any part of that. And until we have equal representation, not only, in Congress, but on the internet, we're not going to have an equal voice in public life.
And the arrival of artificial intelligence has taken disinformation to a whole other stratosphere, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I've been warning for the better part of a decade about the threats that deepfakes play toward women. I saw these technologies used against women in developing countries about 7 years ago. And I've been warning this is something that adversaries of democracies can use to undermine women in opposition, women who are activists, women even who are heads of state or, high-level officials in governments. And now it has come home to roost in many Western democracies with cases in France, cases in the United States, in Spain, of young girls as young as 11 or 12 getting subjected to pornographic deepfake images by their classmates, not to mention the fact that Kamala Harris is certainly subjected to these threats as well as Taylor Swift, and I myself have been depicted in deepfake porn. This is a completely unlevel playing field, and all that is left to do is introduce some regulations to ensure that not only social media platforms, but app stores and payment processors are no longer facilitating what I would say is very close to sexual assault or rape in the digital world. When are we going to put our feet down and say, this is not okay? This isn't about self-expression. It is about undermining and demeaning women and encouraging them not to participate in the public sphere.
And it all comes as tech companies have dropped the ball in recent years when it comes to moderation of content. So what can be done by governments and authorities?
Well, I'm in favor of governments establishing a transparency and oversight regime. I think governments need to be very careful about what they regulate. We don't want governments involved in deciding what speech is acceptable or, related to political speech, especially. That's not a line we want governments to cross. But not only are tech platforms not actioning some of the hateful and even illegal content that we see online right now, based on their own terms of service, the rules that they set for themselves, but they've also cut off data access for researchers like me and journalists. So the study that I mentioned before that I did in 2020 would not be replicable today because Facebook and Twitter and Reddit have all cut off the access that they used to provide to researchers to study what was going on those platforms. So not only do we not have laws that are governing what the platforms are doing, we're totally in the dark about the decisions that they're making. And I think that that's very dangerous for democracies indeed. And that's why regulations like the DSA, which provides researcher data access, and other provisions that are being considered around the world are good things. We need more of those to shine a light on the practices of these global digital public squares that are led by unelected billionaires.
Nina, we're going to have to leave it there. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
To Greenland now, and a group of indigenous women is suing the Danish government over an involuntary birth control campaign launched some 60 years ago. The 143 women were forcibly fitted with contraceptive devices in the 1960s and 70s, with some of them being very young teenagers at the time. Many were left sterile by the procedure, as Olivia Salazar-Winspear reports.
Almost 40 years later, and the memories still raw for Naya Leiberth. She's the first person to have publicly spoken out about the forced contraception she was subjected to as a young girl. Naya was one of thousands of Inuit women who had an intrauterine device fitted without her or her family's consent.
It was very uncomfortable to be asked to spread my legs because I could see that the tools looked much too big for my little girl's body. But at the time, I didn't realize they were for adult women. Yes, it was a very violent experience when he penetrated me with his instrument.
A campaign carried out by the Danish government to limit the birth rate in the Arctic territory of Greenland, mainly populated by indigenous people. Around half of the women of childbearing age there were affected. Greenland's been an autonomous territory since 1953, but the Danish government continued to wield significant control over its former colony. These instances of forced contraception, around half of which rendered women sterile, continued well into the later years of the 20th century. Naya's been campaigning for justice for years, urging other victims to come forward and take legal action. To date, some 150 women have sued the Danish state, and a trial could take place next year.
From my point of view, it has violated a number of human rights. The right to have children, the right to start a family, and the right not to be discriminated against. The right not to be subjected to experiences similar to torture.
Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has acknowledged that this dark chapter of history must be examined, while Greenland's Minister for Justice and Gender says the issue must be tackled with both a legal and political resolution in a bid to reset post-colonial relations between the two populations.
And finally, a clever campaign in the streets of London calling on the UK government to improve parental leave for men. Life-size model babies in slings have been attached to bronze statues of famous men across the city by an organisation called Dad's Shift, a group of men calling for increased paternity leave. Britain is ranked the least generous in Europe for fathers when it comes to parental leave. The babies have been tied to the statues of actors such as Laurence Olivier and Gene Kelly, and footballers such as Thierry Henry and Tony Adams, among others. A great idea. And that's all for this edition. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you, so do reach out with your suggestions via Facebook, Instagram or X. So until the next show, bye for now.